But the guy who's another senior executive called Yamada, he's the president of Rakuten. He got asked what are the benefits of 5G, and you thought, okay, here he's going to say, well, we've got all these new applications.
I'm so pleased you asked.
And he went, well, there's a lot more capacity, isn't there? So you can watch films really quickly, and you get faster, latency for good gaming. Yeah, he was like a bit like Ray Winston as well. He was like, it's like
it's a little bit faster, isn't it?
But it's just a bit. It's a little bit underwhelming.
Fucking one better, isn't it? Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. We've actually managed to come into the studio 2 weeks in a row. Hurrah for us. So as per the new regime, it's just me and Ian from Light Reading. And we are going to chat, sounds like a similar sort of lineup to last week, but some different takes on it. We're going to chat about China rather than just Huawei specifically, although the two are obviously in the telecoms context completely intertwined. Then we're going to talk about 5G, some developments this week that concern 5G in the area of there was a launch by Rakuten.
It was launched by Rakuten in Japan.
Rakuten, is it?
Never quite sure how to pronounce
the A or the U?
I think if you talk to someone from Japan, they'd constantly go, "You're pronouncing it wrong," even though you've tried as much as possible. It's like Spanish, isn't it? You say it and then they say it back, and you say it the same way, and they go, "Nah."
Well, at least right. I know with Spanish it's normally the penultimate vowel.
Well, you're all right with that, but nobody else is.
Maybe that's why I say Rakuten, because I've got a sort of hidden Spanish accent.
So it's supposed to be what? Rakuten?
Well, he says Rakuten,
I say
Rakuten.
I think it's Rakuten, though, I think.
You're probably right.
Do it.
You're probably right. I don't think there's a lot of overlaps between Japanese and Spanish, so I don't think I can pull rank on that one. Anyway, so Rakuten's launched for 5G, and we've got some other stuff that I've already forgotten about that we're going to talk about with 5G, and you'll remind me.
Yeah,
And then we're going to finish off by talking about cloud, specifically telco cloud.
Yeah.
The big US tech companies are getting increasingly interested in the telco space, so that's obviously relevant. And just to remind you that if you're watching it on the site or on YouTube or on Facebook, you can listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and loads of other podcasting platforms. Right, we'll crack on, because yet again, Pierre's on some kind of deadline or other. Such a busy boy. And we're doing this on a Thursday because Pierre's got a birthday party tomorrow.
Well, a small gathering of about 4 people.
Oh yes, certainly no more than 6. Good Lord, no.
It's good for me.
Yes, well, quite that's true. Upside of coronavirus is you don't have to kill yourself doing birthday parties.
Oh God, yeah, that's good.
So yeah, I'll start off China. There was that debate with Trump and Biden this week, which I couldn't watch. We were just saying before we started.
Did they say China a lot in a weird way?
Oh, I don't know, but China, it just becomes the way, before Trump was even president, when he was campaigning, he used to bang on about China the whole time, didn't he?
Yeah.
And he'd always pronounce it in that Trumpy sort of accentuated, narrow-mouthed
it's a horrible
way
voice
that
that he's got, yeah.
I'm not going to go on that tangent, but by the sounds of it, that presidential debate they had was just awful.
I think it was disaster was the word most commentators used. How could they possibly have a second and a third now?
Apparently they're going to change the format because of what happened.
Yeah, well, it's just, I don't know.
There was a lot of talking over the top of each other as well.
Yeah, Trump was trying to give it large, and Biden was trying to give it large back, and it's all just a bit pathetic. And I think that just the saddest thing, just to draw a line under it, is just for Americans. This is their choice.
It's like being presented with Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn, isn't it? God, heaven forbid if that happened, eh?
Yeah, well, Bojo hasn't set the world on fire since, but he didn't come over as anywhere near as much of a douche as Trump did in this thing.
Not quite.
And the equivalent Biden would be more like Sanders in the States.
I think Johnson's got a bit of charisma. Corbyn. He's just totally incompetent, I think. He can be quite charming, I think. I mean, I know not everybody feels he's that way, but
he has his moments, but
and he can be amusing as well.
But I tell you, we won't be so accommodating to him if we stop being able to come in for these pods again, because they've unilaterally said we've all got to lock ourselves in the cellar in case we catch a cold.
He's up for that, having caught it himself. He seems to think that we should.
That does seem to have made him a bit gun shy. Anyway. So we're not going to totally go away from politics, because of course anything to do with the US and China is political. Mm-hmm. So I suppose the most immediate thing to talk about is developments in Europe.
Yeah.
We're getting some vibes. There was you're good at pronouncing German stuff. What's that paper called?
Handelsblatt.
Handelsblatt. There we go.
Yeah, I don't think I am good at pronouncing German.
Well, you
stuff,
better know,
by the way,
haven't you?
but
You're good at. There's sometimes some like Deutsche Telekom guys, and you say,
yeah.
Jacke Vollborn.
yeah, exactly. You got these.
There's him, yeah.
Because the Germans like these 20-letter words with no vowels
Well, that's
in
the
them.
problem. If you go into like a bakery in Germany trying to order something, it's like a whole sentence, like
Yeah.
without spaces in.
Just like what's
between
wrong with
words.
spaces? Do they cost Deutschmarks? Anyway, Handelsblatt, is that it?
And yeah, I think so.
Handelsblatt got a scoop that the German government is. It's not as black and white as the UK did a month or two ago, where we just went, all right, and
Yeah,
total ban by 2028. But they said we're going to the report, which hasn't yet to be confirmed by the German government, I believe, said that they're going to ramp up the security requirements such that it's sort of effectively a ban. And what I thought was most noteworthy about that report is it said that there's going to be a technical security screening process and a political screening process.
right. Okay.
And as soon as you start saying that we're going to assess things politically, then there's no criteria, is it?
No. Well, I think one of the interesting things is that before they'd sort of very much. I think some of these European reports that have been coming out, at the EU level, have sort of tried to do this thing of dividing the network into more sensitive areas and areas we don't have to worry about. And the bit that everybody seems to have been concerned about is the core, which is like it's like the cockpit of the network, I suppose, the control centre where all the decisions are taken. So the idea is if you get access to that, you can really kind of screw up someone's system. And Germany already, I think the operators in Germany have pretty much all said they're not going to use Chinese equipment in the core. So
is it there? Is it in the core right now?
It's
You're
in
much
the
better
core
at
of
knowing.
Deutsche Telekom's network, and they're removing it. They basically said this in earnings calls. The CEO said we're working towards a Chinese-free core.
Right.
Vodafone came out with that announcement months ago, actually, that they're going to spend 200 million to take the Chinese products out of all their core networks in Europe. They haven't got it in the UK, but they've got it in Germany and various other ones. And then Telefonica Deutschland as well has basically said I don't know if they have it already, but they're not going to have Huawei in the 5G core. So they've already sort of taken the step to do that. Now, I guess if the German government then goes and introduces legislation where it says actually the radio access network is a sensitive area as well, which maybe that's one of the things that might happen with this forthcoming legislation. Then that would imply that on the basis of that just being told that this is an area that we should be concerned about. We're not going to use Chinese vendors, and presumably they do exactly the same thing.
Looks like it. So it feels like a sort of mission creep in the direction that the UK went.
Yeah.
But they want to be even more equivocating and ambiguous about doing it.
Yeah.
That's because the German car manufacturers are sweating.
Well, there we are.
Yeah.
Mr. Beamer's going, how am I going to flog?
I think another thing they might do, and this also came out of an earnings call with Deutsche Telekom, where Hertges, the CEO, was asked about the possibility of a Huawei ban. And he said he didn't think a ban was going to happen, but one thing he was pushing for was in this forthcoming legislation, the Electronic Communications Code or whatever it's called, it's just called the Telecoms Act, I think, that they're kind of refining and changing. One of the things he wanted to see happen was for Open RAN requirements to be included in that in future.
Right.
So if your basically networks have to be, they have to have open interfaces, they have to be, we talk about ORAN all the time on this podcast, but they have to basically adhere to those specifications. The idea being that it would, it brings the kind of competition into the landscape that everybody's pushing for, and it means you don't have black boxes, you've got more visibility, so you can sort of push it from a security perspective in a way. But the thing that's interesting about that is that Huawei is vigorous. Is still pretty vigorously opposed to Open RAN, and I find it very hard to see how, you can sort of see Nokia's more, I think, amenable to it than the other big vendors, and Ericsson's now starting to say, well, in the future we're going to have to maybe move that way.
But they've always been a bit unconvincing.
They've always been a bit unconvincing. But Huawei, the trouble is that even if they did change tack and say, well, actually Open RAN's something we probably need to support, can you really see Open RAN sort of, the thing about Open RAN is it's a community. Everybody works together. It's about using different vendors, mixing and matching. And you're going to have to change equipment anyway to get there. It's not like you can leave your stuff there. So it sort of gives Deutsche Telekom an excuse to to upgrade and take stuff out and put in new ORAN equipment. And then maybe if Huawei does adapt and start to do stuff that's ORAN compliant, they have the option, but they wouldn't necessarily do it. And I still find it odd that I just don't see how ORAN would fit with Huawei's sort of modus operandi. It's quite a sort of closed company anyway. I think
But that's the central issue, isn't it?
Yeah.
So they have all these centres like we got in the UK, which I still maintain. I had no problem with the rationale we had at the start of the year, with our security people going, look, we can take this stuff to bits.
Yeah.
We can see whether there's any backdoors or any vulnerabilities. And I'm totally convinced that the only reason we changed is, well, there's two. I think it's a political decision, but what the Americans did by restricting access to all these chips that we chatted about last week, they gave the sort of the political arm of the security bits, the bits where the security and the politicians overlap in the Venn diagram, all the pretext they needed to go, oh, well, it's changed now.
Yeah.
The security situation's changed, so our recommendations changed. But that's just the veneer for the political decision as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think it's both, because I think even if there aren't restrictions on Huawei, and even if you get countries that say, well, we don't care about any of that, we're going to carry on, it's up to the operators, I still think operators would look at that move and be worried about what happens to. I mean, there's a lot of analysts warning that you've got all sorts of expectations about what might happen to Huawei now in the future, but I don't think anybody's saying this isn't going to have some impact on Huawei's competitiveness. It's probably going to become
ORAN.
Not ORAN, the
German thing.
No, the US restrictions.
Oh, yeah.
The US restrictions will. The worst case scenario, according to some analysts, is that Huawei runs out of inventory in a year and a half, whatever, and ends up going out of business somehow. Or, probably more likely is that it's going to have to fall back on something that isn't as good, basically.
Yeah, it's hard to see how they can make decent phones.
Same with network equipment.
As per our chat last week, same goes for the chips in network equipment.
So they basically, there's no way. I haven't spoken to. I've spoken to a few people on this, and I haven't spoken to one person who knows about semiconductors and has talked about this. Who says this isn't going to have any impact on them.
Of course,
no one said they've got alternatives that they can go to that are as good as what they use at the moment. And they've all said they might get there in the future. If they were given 5 or 6 years, you might be able to start developing those sort of US tools and the equivalent of the US tools that are so essential to the semiconductor industry. I think we talked about this last week, didn't we? Applied materials and all that lot.
Yeah, I don't think you suddenly start.
You can't do that overnight. It takes years, apparently.
Especially when you get into the manufacturing processes and the sheer amount of R&D and engineering grunt that goes into perpetuating Moore's law and reducing that manufacturing process by a node every year and a half or whatever.
So if you're an operator seeing all this, you're going, hang on a minute, one of our suppliers is in a situation where it's going to run out of decent inventory in a year's time. They're going to lose. I mean, everybody's gone on about how great they are compared to their big rivals. That's been one of the stories of the last sort of few years, that they're extremely competitive and have technology
18 months ahead
stuff.
Of everyone.
I think that's total rubbish, but I think there are some areas where they seem to be really, really good, and I think that's fair. But if they lose that, and if there's a danger they run out of stock and can't carry on supplying you anyway, then why would you carry on using? Whatever your government says, you're going to be looking at this going, any CTO is going to be saying, we need to move to a different vendor.
So I take your point that now, because the US has created a situation where starving it of kit will necessarily make it a security threat just by virtue of not, even just not being able to maintain its existing kit or whatever. So there's all that. So there's various excuses, and I think the Americans have done a good job of a combination of applying pressure through the entity list, and then applying diplomatic pressure. And so that's what seems to be manifesting itself in Germany. Again, unconfirmed, but according to this report, and they said this is from chatting to people in the government, and it'd be unlikely for them to just make it up. So I think we can assume it's fairly legit.
Yeah.
And so, yes, it's this political consideration.
Yeah.
So, Huawei can open itself up as much as it wants. But the political consideration, again, basically comes down to, as we've chatted about loads of times on this pod, are you Chinese or not?
Yeah,
is the political consideration, because there is something intrinsically distrustful. Now, I don't think
something intrinsically dirty. I think
and this isn't. I should stress this is not in reference to Chinese people or race or this isn't blind xenophobia.
No, it's the government.
This is very much an informed position taken from the view that, and I'll get to sort of further evidence of this in a sec, that I suppose the slightly more xenophobic thing is an intrinsic shiftiness that is sort of assumed. But the more substantial thing is, evidence that they claim to have that they have got up to no good, industrial espionage. Everyone knows that they've done things like currency manipulation. Everyone knows that they haven't played by WTO rules, by illegally supporting domestic champions.
Well, I think there's also the ethical point, isn't there? That is it a good idea to be buying stuff from a totalitarian state? That has. I mean, this has been raised.
We buy oil from Saudi Arabia or whatever.
Sure, but there are a lot of people say we shouldn't. And one of the things that's come up repeatedly, I think, with Huawei when politicians have got involved is, well, they've got millions of people in concentration camps, the Uyghur Muslims. That always gets brought up, So it's definitely Saudi Arabia's all right because Saudi Arabia is basically not a threat to the world order. They're just a bunch of Middle Easterners running around selling oil.
Geopolitically, they're a counterweight to Iran as well.
Yeah, but China, you're talking about, one of the world's big superpowers. They're the new Russia in a way, aren't they? I mean, Russia's still an issue in itself.
They're the new Russia.
The USSR, rather, the new USSR.
Well, the new USSR with 10 times the economy that the USSR ever had.
Would we have bought equipment off the USSR? Would Western countries have bought equipment
back in the day?
Back in the day?
Yeah,
so
we haven't
China's
officially announced Cold War. We haven't got a red stamp and gone Cold War.
But it is the Cold War. It's a tech Cold War. I think people have used that.
And a trade Cold War.
Yeah, I think the other thing is on the, you're talking about the political pressure from the US. And I was just saying that operators might just decide to act anyway because they're worried about supplies and competitiveness of Huawei gear. I think there's signs of some political pressure, directly from US politicians on the operators themselves. And
wouldn't put it past them.
Well, Telefonica's a really interesting one because they've got this Clean Networks campaign in the US at the moment.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that was interesting, Mike Dana wrote a story on this, Mike at Light Reading, and there were statements in that from Telefonica's CEO where he was actually the specific quote was one of the most interesting canned quotes I think I've ever read, where he'd said, we have clean networks. This is taking the US definition of clean, which basically means no Chinese gear. We have clean networks in Spain and the UK, and we're going to be working towards them in Germany and Brazil.
So that's total compliance.
Which sounds like Telefonica Deutschland, which does have a lot of Huawei gear in the radio access network. I mean, if you take that, this is the CEO of the group, if you take that to its, what it seems to imply is to get rid of the Huawei RAN gear, in the next few years. So I don't see a future for them in Europe. And
then on top of that, just to put the cherry on the cake, there's one I just wrote quite quickly before I scurried off to do this pod, which is there was a joint press conference with Mike Pompeo, the American Secretary of State for just getting stuff done, and the Italian Foreign Minister, Di Maio, I think is his name. And Di Maio basically came out. This wasn't even a response to a journalist question. It's in his prepared speech going like, we're totally with the US on 5G security. It's really important. And we're always telling the EU that we got to get our shit together on this one. But we're still going to do it the EU way. That, he wasn't going to stick his neck out too far and enrage, Ursula.
Yeah.
So I don't want to be part of any block that's run by someone called Ursula.
Yeah, she belongs in the James Bond
Sounds like someone's
film.
great granny. Anyway,
that's a Little Mermaid.
Is she Ursula? I thought she was Ariel.
Yeah, Ariel, but then the villain is Ursula.
Oh right.
It makes me think of
you've got younger children than me. You're more familiar with this stuff. Anyway, attacking people's names gratuitously aside. So he basically said that, and so. My view is that Germany steers the EU anyway.
Yeah.
And if Germany decides it's time, then that's how it's going to happen. But the fact that the Italians are coming out...
and France has already done it.
Right.
In a sort of surreptitious way. They've basically said they're not going to renew.
A sneaky French way.
Well, it's not too dissimilar to what Germany's doing, I suppose, that Germany's introducing laws that might just make it difficult. Whereas I think France has said it won't renew Huawei licenses in its different regions.
They're trying to give themselves some kind of diplomatic wriggle room with the Chinese, basically, aren't they?
Rather than just go at it like the UK, like a sort of bullet a gate, like you.
Well, we tried. We tried half measures, and then we bottled it.
Friends of Germany are like, "Ooh, it's a bit awkward, but yeah."
I think
we're not going to be.
They're not part of Five Eyes though, so they were never going to have been under the same amount of pressure.
No, that's true. That's true. I think that's just the. That's going to be how history remembers the Johnson regime. we tried to give it a proper go, and then we bottled it.
Yeah. On various things.
Quite, yeah. I mean, God, I was just reading a thing. Sorry, permit me another little coronavirus tangent. Just reading a thing about the sort of Swedish example and all the data points and all this, that, and the other. And I've chatted to Swedes about it as well, and how increasingly it seems clear that their approach was right. Even some of the counterpoints, like, it's a much smaller population and all that sort of thing. Population density is no less than Scotland, for example.
Yeah.
But they're doing a lot better. And of course, the key thing is not so much their case rate or fatality rate, but that their economy is doing fine.
Yeah.
I think Swedish stock exchange hit a new high.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, I suppose the other thing is they didn't incur all that debt to prop things up.
Well,
did they?
quite, yeah. So they're just in much better shape.
I think they took a GDP fall, but the stories that have concentrated on that didn't point out the fact that they didn't incur.
Yeah, they didn't have to bail everyone
trillions in doing what we've done, whatever.
I know.
Trillions of, what is it? I can't remember what the currency is. But,
krona over there.
Yeah, it'd be krona. Yeah.
Crowns. I believe that is Swedish for crowns. It's good, proper old school money. You want money called things like crowns and shekels
Drachma.
and stuff. Yeah, exactly. Bloody
Shekels,
euros.
Yeah, shekels is a good one.
So they're all on board, and I agree with you. I think their days are numbered. I think I wrote at the end of one of my pieces, the thought of Europe being Huawei free by the end of this decade is totally plausible.
Yeah,
we've gone for 2028 as the final cut-off point.
Well, this is what I think that countries need, and this is the other thing I think about France's route. Like when equipment licenses come up for expiry, we won't renew them, and Germany sort of saying new legislation that's forthcoming. It gives them, they need a glide path.
Yeah.
The worst thing for Tinnitus Herges is if someone comes along and goes, right, next year you need to be
all over.
That's a disaster.
Yeah, because they can, by that stage, they can do their calculations about depreciation and natural.
And they do an upgrade every
out.
few years anyway.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
You're going to do. This is the point that our friend John Strand has often gone on about, and I think been sort of vindicated, hasn't he? Because there was all this stuff coming out about how swapping Huawei's gear is going to cost billions and billions, and no one's going to have any money left after it. And he quite rightly pointed out that you need to upgrade a lot of stuff anyway, so the incremental cost isn't that high. And then BT's basically gone, that's right, it's only going to cost $5. It's going to be the same to replace the whole lot.
As long as you give us long enough.
Yeah. So
I got a funny one actually. John was just messaged me a story saying UK found critical weakness in Huawei equipment last year.
I saw that.
Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And I looked through it and it looked like it was...
It looked like an old story to me.
It looked like an old story. It looked like broadband routers.
Yeah.
And so I texted back routers, and he texted back Bloomberg, which I thought was quite good. I don't even know if he meant it a joke, because I went lol and he didn't lol back. But I thought that was quite funny because my pushback was like routers, not that exciting.
And we've already banned them.
If it was some big ass switch in the core,
it would be a bigger story if we still hadn't taken the decision as well. Surely, it's like who cares anymore? They're out. They're off in a few years.
Yeah.
I mean, the fixed line thing's a bit more. In fairness, the fixed line thing's not quite clear yet, is it? What their role could be there.
So yes, so I think we agree that their days are numbered. It's just a matter of time, and certainly by 2030, there's not going to be a lot of it about unless something changes. Trump wins the election, goes around Xi Jinping's house.
Yeah.
Xi Jinping goes, "All right, Trump, how's it going, mate?"
Like Ray Winston.
Yeah, exactly.
Like a Chinese Ray Winston.
He's all right, nice one, mate. And
365.
And Trump goes, look, I was just mucking about to win the election. Now that I won it, we're all right, mate. Don't worry about it. And then maybe we'll be good, but I doubt it.
And presumably by the late 2020s.
In fact, after that thing we were talking about earlier, I doubt he'll win the election. He's just revealed his inner douchebag too.
Although even if he doesn't win, he might stay in the White House anyway. Who knows?
It's going to be.
It's going to be a mess towards the end of this year. You just know it.
Just that icing on the cake of 2020.
Yeah. The big climax, just like.
Do you know what I mean?
And then the aliens.
Yeah.
on New Year's Eve.
The boss battle right at the end. So one other thing I wanted to say. Sorry, Ian, I just interrupted. I
was going to say, presumably by the late 2020s as well, if all goes to plan, you lose Huawei, but you gain some other companies that we don't have at the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? Now we're supposedly trying to cultivate alternatives and make.
That was that thing. I don't know if we chatted about it
startups.
last week. That task force.
Yeah, this is what this. Oh, yeah, we didn't mention the task
Right.
force that was set up in the UK with all these luminaries like
Yeah.
Ian Livingston, who's now some kind of baron.
To be honest,
used to lead
the only
BT,
thing that
didn't
gave
he?
it more credibility for me was Ross Singleton, who did the
Yeah. Well, it's-
Telecoms.com live.
I think there were
thing.
good people on it.
She
Scott
knows her
Petty's on
stuff.
it. Scott Petty's on it from
Yeah,
Vodafone.
yeah.
I don't know about Ian Livingston. I mean, it seems funny that he's there because he was one of the guys who gave Huawei its first big break in the UK. He was a senior executive at BT
Right.
when they got their
Yes.
first optical deals, and then he led it for 5 years while their share was growing.
And then Huawei
So-
UK, which its non-exec board is riddled with BT Knights of the
Yeah,
Realm.
exactly. Yeah, you go and join it afterwards,
Yeah.
don't you? But
So yes, I mean, I'm not sure what a thing will do. Like I said, people like Roz are good. People like the techies at the operators obviously know their stuff.
yeah. But I think one of the things we've done really badly in this country is, you look at Japan. I think we're going to talk about Japan in a minute, but just sort of preempting that.
Sure.
One of the things that Japan seems to be keen on doing with this whole security debate and move away from Huawei is to try and strengthen some of the companies that it has, tech companies that make 5G equipment, and invest in new ones and find sort of alternatives. And I see, the US has got, it's got these Open RAN software companies that could become a much bigger deal in the future. And the UK just doesn't seem to have
No.
any. And presumably this is one
We've
of
got
the
a
things
task
the
force. What are you
is-
moaning about?
Shall
I
we
mean,
sell some merch on the task force? The task force.
Right, task force
t-shirts.
merch.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's
we
a
could have
crack
sort of,
squad of
Yeah.
telecom.
sort of Team America type of thing.
Yeah,
That little,
like the Avengers.
yeah.
It is, yeah.
Um,
It's more like the Expendables.
yeah, there's a funny story of that task force thing. So we wrote a story. One of the freelancers who's filling the Jamie-shaped void.
Mm-hmm.
So for people who aren't aware, if you ever read Total Telecom, we've got Nick and Mary who ran Total Telecom for years. Now writing a couple of stories a day.
They're not really the same shape as Jamie, though, are they? Either of them.
No, I can't imagine how we could square that one. But they're metaphorically filling the hole and doing a very good job as well.
Yeah.
And Mary wrote one about this thing, and she characterised it as this task force. She characterised it as an anti-Huawei task force.
Yeah.
And behind the scenes, without naming any names, Huawei sort of pushed back a little bit and had a bit of a moan, saying, well, it's not anti-Huawei, it's just there for, to increase diversity. And I was a bit like, yeah, but why are they suddenly going on about it now? It's because we've turfed Huawei out of the country.
Yeah.
Anyway, in the end, I went, look, I'll tell you what, I'll write a little follow-up, making it clear that Huawei doesn't reckon that this is about them at all. But then while I was writing it, I was like, well, you can reckon that, but it still is.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe they are right that specifically to characterise that task force as explicitly anti-Huawei is technically inaccurate. But the whole reason it exists is because Huawei's been kicked out.
Yeah.
And the whole reason it exists is to replace Huawei.
Yeah.
So it's not pro-Huawei, is it?
No.
That's for sure. So anyway, that was a little follow-up I did there. And one other thing before I move it on, that's why I kept holding my phone. So if I hold it here, it makes a little buzzy sound, does it?
Interference or something.
At the start of the week, I wrote a story headlined, China becomes increasingly radicalised in response to reported SMIC ban. And so SMIC is the Semiconductor Manufacturer International China, or whatever it stands for. And this again was just a report rather than an official ban. But I haven't seen anything this week that refutes the report or confirms it, if I'm honest. Not that I've been looking. But Reuters reported that that suppliers of equipment to SMIC will have to apply for a special export license.
It's now on the entity list, yeah.
Right. So it is. I don't know. I haven't seen if the US has made an official.
I'd read a
announcement
report, and
about
I haven't covered this story myself, but I'd read that it was. And
Well,
I
if
don't
this
know that
report's
was just
accurate, then
reports.
yes, it's on the entity list. And we've spoken about it, I think, in the pod before, that I just found it weird that a Chinese company has to ask the US for permission to do business.
Yeah.
But there we go.
Well, it just shows the clout the US has got to mess up.
Well, it
business,
does.
doesn't
It does, which is, I'm in two minds about. Just in a pure sort of due process way, for one country to be able to impose its will on any other country.
Well, it's similar with we're getting off topic a bit here, but it's similar when when Ericsson got fined recently for corporate sort of bribery and all sorts of dodgy behaviour between I don't know, it was dated back to 2000, before the current leadership.
I remember
anyway.
that, and that had been rumbling for years.
It'd been rumbling
hadn't
for years. They'd all been going around bribing officials in markets for deals. Basically, I think was the sort of charge, and they agreed to settle it with this $1 billion fine to the DOJ, and it was just a very strange thing.
But a lot of the alleged crimes have been committed nowhere near the States.
Exactly, and yet the US can come along and say you have to pay us this money, and then what happens with that money? They just use that to build roads or whatever. Or,
do you know what I mean?
it doesn't seem quite right.
It is funny when you get an imbalance in power dynamics. It doesn't matter whether it's your ally or a country you're less warmly disposed towards. They deserve examination, just like we should be examining the unilateral way in which the government can just tell us what to do at the moment, but we're failing to. Anyway, I'm not going to go off on that tangent again. Pierre's starting to look worried. Bloody yet another coronavirus tangent.
Actually,
he loves tangents.
Before we move on, can I do a quick shout out to our listeners down under?
Oh yeah,
in Sydney, and to people in San Jose del Monte in the Philippines. Big listeners.
Well, actually, that's a relevant story because that was another of Mary's ones where she wrote about Globe in the Philippines, probably blanking Huawei, and that got loads of reads over the last weekend. That got absolutely tons of reads. We often get that. We get ones go viral in the Far East over the weekend. So that's obviously relevant. It's not just Europe. Philippines just around the corner from China, isn't it?
Yeah.
So if that starts happening, that's especially worrying for Huawei. Philippines, it must be noted, has among the stronger US connections, I believe, of the countries in Southeast Asia. Yeah. So there's probably an angle there.
They were almost a colony at one point, weren't they? There's a bit of neo-colonialism going on there. Yeah.
There was a bit of that going on, and the US has got things like Guam and all that. Yeah. And the Philippines itself, it's got a sort of big Hispanic aspect to
Formerly
it.
Spanish.
I'm not exactly, because it was a Spanish colony, I guess. I guess it's called that because it's named after King Philip or something. Anyway, so we got all that going on. But this SMIC thing, there was just some interesting commentary in the Chinese press, specifically the, what's it called? Like the Global Times or something like that.
That's the very state-affiliated one, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And when I check in with Wei, he goes, it's not like the news agency, Xinhua or whatever that's called. But basically, if you know what's good for you and you're a Chinese publication, you make sure that the Communist Party is not going to get the hump when you publish something. So you can assume if it's not the word of the Communist Party, it's at least got the green light from them.
Yeah.
And they had a headline that said, China, this was an op-ed, but quite a prominent one, China needs a new long tech march after US attack on SMIC. And the Long March, I had to remind myself what this is, but it's a Chinese Civil War thing that's got sort of legendary status because it was the Communist Party having to basically march all around the country to escape the clutches of the Kuomintang, who were the opposition in the Civil War. One that cleared off to Taiwan. And then eventually they all got together somewhere, regrouped, and then went and won the war. Yeah. And a lot of that was added to Chairman Mao's legendary status and all that sort of thing. So it basically, when you use a term like Long March, there's a very specific reference to sort of Cultural Revolution and all that sort of thing. So it's very sort of politicized. Wow. It's also something that other communist parties, like the German Communist Party, have referred to in the 60s, the Long March through the institutions, as the way in which communism inevitably collapses, horrid, smelly capitalism, and wins the day. Yeah. So when you're starting to get rhetoric like this, it just points to, that's the radicalization I was talking to her. And I mentioned last week that she, basically wants to appropriate private enterprise now for, he hasn't used this word, but for what's something that sounds like a great leap forward, which is another Cultural Revolution thing. A great leap forward led to this genocide. Yeah. Because everyone starved because they were too busy melting spoons or whatever.
So the Russians used to use that sort of thing.
Crazy stuff they came up with.
Usually 5-year plan, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Basically some great big collectivist, let's all push in one direction. So I suppose that's the long and short of it, is China is starting to go, right, the only way we can combat this American sort of trade and diplomatic aggression against us is to kind of mobilize the whole country, which is quite worrying to me. Yeah. Because, once you start mobilizing, it can take on a certain, as students of the world wars and stuff, will be able to attest it can take on a certain irresistible momentum. So anyway, so that cheery note is where I'll leave the sort of China thing on, but it's basically getting more tasty by the week. Is the long and short.
Anything is possible this year.
Yeah,
Yeah, do you know what I mean? And you know, and it's all intertwined. I mean, they must watch all this crazy stuff going on in the States and just be thinking, well, this has got to be good for us.
Yeah.
Anyway, so let's change the subject. Let's go 5G, and I'll hand the ball over to you. What have we been chatting about? Rakuten, I guess.
Yeah, that's been the main thing, I suppose, this week for me, because they're a very closely watched company as one of the pioneers of cloud and software and open RAN technologies, and they're a big internet firm basically. They're like the Asian Amazon, I guess, in a way. And they've come along.
Because before this it was like content and digital services.
In fact, I think even on my smart TV you can sort of subscribe to Rakuten.
Yeah, it comes up on my one too.
Yeah. So they're big.
Samsung,
they're very much like Amazon, you know, try and tie you into their little ecosystem. And I mean, this is partly to do with why they've gone into telecom. They want customers they can sign up to all sorts of other services, and you get tokens you can use for telecom. You can also use them to buy a movie on your Samsung TV or whatever. But anyway, they've come along and they've built this. They're building this fourth mobile network in Japan, which is quite a bold move in itself, because it's a very technologically advanced market.
And
it's got three big incumbents that are very well established, as you say. Not considered to be that price sensitive as a market by analysts, and yet they've come along with these sort of newfangled low cost technologies and said we can massively undercut. All very cloudy. We can really undercut the other players and still make profits in the long run, and build business, and sort of give something back, and then they get new customers for their other parts of their sort of Rakuten empire as well.
So it's that internet model of scaling and then the network effect.
And they'd already launched 4G in April, and were expected to follow that up fairly quickly with a 5G launch, but that got delayed because of coronavirus. I think they sort of blamed that on some disruption to like software activities that were going on in labs. They do some of that in India, and I don't know.
No one could chat to each other.
The details were awkward, but it slowed it down by a few months, and then they launched it this week. And I don't know. I was a bit underwhelmed, to be honest with you, by the update.
Why's that?
Well, I think following up on the 4G one was always going to be a bit difficult anyway, because that was actually the mobile service first appearing.
Yeah.
And a lot of the headline stuff there was kind of repeated in this one. It was, it is quite a bold thing to do, I suppose, that they've kept exactly the same price. So they come in with this $28 a month offer for the 4G service. And it was about half as much as what you get with an equivalent service through NTT Docomo, let's say, or KDDI. So what are they going to do with 5G? Everybody's wondering on pricing. And it's $28. It's exactly the same fee. It's the same fee.
No premium at all.
No premium at all, which is an even bigger saving. I think they're saying it's about 70% compared to the 5G.
Yeah, that was the diagram.
So really undercutting the other players. Yeah. Now I guess the question is whether does it matter that much to Japanese consumers, because if you look at you look at what happened with Jio in India, which they're often compared to because some of the staff have actually come across from Jio.
And also Jio is much more than just an operator, isn't it?
It's much more than an operator, and it was greenfield. It had used a lot of these sort of not quite as sophisticated, I think, as Rakuten, but it would certainly done things in a more cloudy way than the established companies. But the thing about India is that everybody said it's ripe for disruption. Nobody's done a particularly good job. There is scope for offering things at lower rates and building a business, and it's very price sensitive. There's loads of rural consumers that don't get services because they can't afford them.
Yeah, the GDP per capita in India is pretty different to Japan.
And they very quickly, I mean, what's happened to Jio? They're now the biggest company in India.
Yeah,
it's
with a bit of help from the
absolutely
government.
remarkable, with some help from the government.
Yeah.
With Rakuten, the figure they cite, having launched in April, by the end of June, they said they had 1 million applications.
Yes.
Now, applications
doesn't mean subscribers. That
means people asking for a service. They've been very coy on that subscriber number, and they weren't prepared on the call to give an update, even though it's now October, which makes you think, I mean, if it was really good, they'd say so, wouldn't they?
Quite.
Who wouldn't? So,
and why is it so difficult for them to turn an application into a subscriber?
Well, this is the other question. What's the hold up there?
Yeah.
But it does obviously lend some weight to the analysts who are saying it's not a very price sensitive market and people care more about quality. They're prepared to pay. I think on the quality front, the jury's out a little bit. I mean, they have these wonderful stats where they say our network can cope with twice as much data traffic and customer satisfaction levels are very high on 4G. But the 5G launch itself, I mean, for a start, it's not very widely available.
No,
you can only get it in very few
cities.
areas. So, you know, it's not the sort of thing that's going to drive a lot of customers, I don't think, at the moment, because most people in the country basically can't get the service. And the speeds were, I mean, to me, they sound really good. Like 870 megabits per second was a sort of headline offer. But the Japanese media who were on the call were obviously not very impressed. They were sort of suggesting it's not as good as what the other companies are offering. You know, sub gigabit was like a bad thing, obviously, on the call.
Effort. I looked into that, though, and in their presentation, they said that we expect to get it up to like over 2 gig by November.
They do, yeah.
So what that made me think, so I don't disagree with any of your perspectives that you've voiced so far. What that made me think is that this is a rush to launch.
Yeah.
That if they'd waited till November, they would have had a much better speed to talk about. Or if they'd waited till Q1 next year, where their little diagram said that they expect to have nationwide coverage, whatever that will mean.
Yeah.
But I think all the prefectures or whatever they call their counties or states or whatever.
Yeah.
So they're just doing it a bit early, and I think that in itself was a product of the promises they made during the 4G launch.
Yeah.
So I just think they put themselves under a lot of time
pressure. They put under pressure, and I suppose it's better to have, you know, maybe they just felt they had to get something up. And there was a call today, actually, that I was on with Tarek Amin, who's the CTO. He was talking about that November upgrade.
And he's got real
kudos
CV,
in the
hasn't
industry, yeah, and he's very smart.
Wasn't he at Geo? Was that
he
right?
was at Geo, yeah. And he was talking actually specifically about how they get to 2 gigabits per second, and it all sounds very feasible, actually.
Right.
And it sounds like the thing for me is the subscriber numbers aren't great on 4G, yeah. So I think they've really got something to prove there with 5G, whether it's going to sort of make a big difference. They've got the problem that actually a lot of 5G companies at the moment have got, which is there aren't many handsets. They're offering two. One's their own branded device, which looks really good.
Do we know who the OEM of that is?
I don't know who the OEM is, but it looks very good. And then there's a
I've got a feeling I saw
phone.
somewhere. I think it might be Sony.
Okay. Well, that would make sense.
Or Sharp.
Sharp's the other one.
Aquos.
That's the other one
That's
they're
Sharp
offering.
brand, isn't it?
So they're offering two.
Right, anyway, a couple of Japanese companies.
So it's not a big range of handsets. If you prefer other brands, you're going to have to wait. And the other thing,
buy Sharp phones.
Yeah, but the other thing I was a bit underwhelmed by is you come in with a 5G service as a company that's an internet firm, very disruptive, doing all sorts of radical things. You know, you'd sort of think they'd come along on the service side and say, and you can get this with it, which nobody else has done. And the president, whose name I'm probably going to mess up, I think it's Yamada.
Right.
Not the guy who's the CEO of the whole racketing group. The sort of
he's called Mickey Mantle or something.
Mikitani.
Oh, there we go.
Hiroshi Mikitani, I think is his name.
But I thought he had a alliterative name.
But the guy he's Mickey, gets referred to as Mickey, but that's just
that's taken from his surname. Oh, I get it now.
But the guy
how cruel of his parents.
I know. I think he's just picked that, to be honest with you, because no one in the West can sort of say Hiroshi properly.
Right.
So. But the guy who's another senior executive called Yamada, he's the president of Rakuten. He got asked what are the benefits of 5G. And you thought, okay, here he's going to say, well, we've got all these new applications.
I'm so pleased you asked.
And he went, well, there's a lot more capacity, isn't there? So you can watch films really quickly, and you get
faster,
latency for good gaming. Yeah, he was like a bit like Ray Winston as well. He was like, it's like
it's a little bit faster, isn't it?
But it's just a bit. It's a little bit underwhelming.
Fucking one better, isn't it?
So I don't know. I mean, Tarek Amin's a really convincing guy, and I think what they're doing on the technology side is interesting and exciting. And they have these Japanese firms that they're using as alternatives to the big kit vendors, and it all sounds great. But I just feel on the consumer adoption side of things, I think they've got quite a lot to prove. And the trouble is that if you're pricing things at that level as well, you really need a lot of traffic. You need a lot of business to be able to break even on your rollout costs. And they can talk as much as they want about how much more cost effective their technologies are and how much they're saving, but they've still got to send engineers around the country. They've still got to build out mobile sites. They're a greenfield place. They racked up massive losses, but they racked up losses at last quarter because of the mobile rollout.
Well, their CapEx,
that's the whole group.
Their CapEx must be massive,
and it's going to take them longer to break even if they've got to. If you're going to price things really low, you've got to attract a lot of business. Yeah,
right. That's the scalable internet model.
Or you put 5G up at a premium price and maybe accept less.
I assume they're doing is the reason they're not putting a premium on 5G, and they know that they're launching it a bit early, is they're going to people, look at all the extra stuff you keep getting for no extra price. Yeah, 5G might be in its infancy now, but they guarantee that price for a certain while. They're giving 3 million subscriptions away for free. Aren't they?
Yeah.
Which actually, that's pretty damning. If they haven't even managed 1 million subscribers and there's 3 million for free, then there's 2 million just sitting there gathering dust.
But the question is, in a way, why get into the networks game at all? They already had 100 million subscribers, right? This is a lot. They're a big company.
Really? To their sort of TV and
to their
digital
other
services.
Their digital services was how many they had.
I see. So you're questioning the whole premise.
Yeah, I mean,
for this strategic
Amazon's
move.
not going to go and build. Well, they'll probably do this now that I've just said this, but they're not going to go and build a radio network, are they? Google's not going to go and build a radio network.
Amazon had one go at smartphones.
Microsoft's not going to build a radio network. We're going to talk about this in a minute, the cloud side of things, but. But they're not
going to get into the actual.
Why get into what you're pricing something really low? So you're probably not going to make a lot of money, even with a few million customers. If you're pricing it that low, okay, your costs are a lot lower anyway, so your margins are.
So you're saying why not be just more like Virgin Media and just be an MVNO and let that be?
Well, why even bother being? If they've already got 100 million customers that they can sell all these whizzy services on, and they've got they're not a capital intensive company like an operator is. Why even get into that game at all?
Well, I think now you're sort of starting a conversation about multiplay and the wisdom of that.
Well. I've got a theory about why they want to be in it.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
My theory about why they want to be in it is this is not about the Japanese telecom market. This is about the international telecom market. So this gets you into this Rakuten communications platform, which is basically their attempt to build like a sort of telco cloud where you can come along. So say you're another operator, maybe a greenfield player like Dish, for instance, which is the one doing the same sort of thing in the US. You come along and Rakuten's got this storefront, almost like an app store, where you can go and you can pick and choose technologies and applications.
Basically the plumbing in a box, isn't it?
Yeah. But you can get a lot of the software that they're using. So for instance, Altiostar, which is the company that actually Rakuten majority owns, it's a US firm but it's majority owned by Rakuten. They do the software for the radio access network, and that is now a part of the Rakuten communications platform. And you could, in theory, as another operator, you could come along and buy Altiostar software through the Rakuten communications platform and sort of run that in a sort of cloud, basically. Yeah, you're still going to go out and buy your hardware and shit, but
which is, let's not forget, and we will, and we're leading up to going into this in slightly more depth, but that's the cloud dream, is that you can have this off the peg sort of marketplace of quite advanced sort of technological products, because everything's virtualized and softwareized and interchangeable and in containers. You can just Lego it all together. Yeah, that's the dream.
But that is I think. I mean, they've put a value on that, which is, and I don't know whether this is an annual value, but I don't know where they've got this from. But they've said they value that market at up to $380 billion. That is a much bigger opportunity to go around the world and be, let's say they become the main provider of telco cloud services to other operators in the future. I'm not saying they will, because there's obviously lots of competition, but if they could, that's a much, much bigger opportunity. And the reason they're doing what they're doing in Japan is to prove this stuff works. Yeah, so they have to prove this stuff works and show that these new technologies.
I think you might be onto something, because Japanese oligarchs on the whole, like Masayoshi Son, is that his name?
Oh, that idiot.
But the only reason I'm bringing him up is because it wasn't enough for him to just have SoftBank. He's got to go and get involved in everything. Yeah. And maybe this lad, Mickey, has got to get involved in other stuff as well. And there's a couple of other people who would back you up. As I embedded a Twitter stream from another independent analyst called Dean Bubley. Yeah. And he'd been going on about how this, what you were just describing, should be a matter of concern to incumbents everywhere. Yeah. Especially in the context of consolidation, because typically, like in Europe, where they've seemed to decide you've got to have 4 operators. If you have consolidation and such to 3, then the government's going to insist on a new startup operator. Yeah. And that startup operator now has the potential to just go off to Rakuten and go, we'll have your cutting edge thing in a box, please.
Well, I think the government, I mean, we're getting off topic a bit here, but I'm not sure Europe's going to carry on doing that, because that's been the problem in the past, hasn't it? That's not really consolidation then. You're just basically keeping it as a full play. This is what they did in Italy, isn't it? You can merge, but you need to go and sell a load of stuff to Iliad.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is flawed, and that is, as you say, something we could discuss in depth. But his point was if.
Yeah.
if a vacuum is created, it's now more likely to be filled by a very competitive.
So you know the other
new
one that's
player.
doing this, United Internet in Germany, one
Okay, I
and one
don't know about
drillage.
that. Oh yeah. Drillage,
That's
right.
United Internet. It's the
Okay.
same company. They're building a fourth mobile network in Germany. They picked up spectrum in the auction. They're doing Open RAN.
There we go.
They've not provided details of. I mean, I tried to get in touch with them. Actually, they didn't respond to me. So if you're listening, United Internet,
Yeah.
then come on.
Sort
But
drillage.
they've not sort of said more about who they're using and when they plan to launch and what they're doing. But they did make like an investor presentation where they said it's going to be an Open RAN rollout. So
And the other person I've got to give a shout out to, and actually that'll allow us to sort of move on to, we're not going to be able to talk about that other 5G thing we chatted about because we banged on about other things so much.
Oh, yeah.
That little report on how important it is.
well, it's all been interesting now. Hasn't it?
Yeah. No, it's just time. I spoke to someone called Danielle Royston, who used to be CEO of a company called Optiva and is now setting up her own thing, the precise form of which I don't think has yet to be announced. But I was chatting to her, and she was sort of confirming that similar angle on, this does all seem like it's a source of extra strategic concern for incumbent operators everywhere.
Yeah.
And then the other thing we chatted about, and she'd provided a quote which I used, which is our sort of final segment talking about telco cloud, was Microsoft made an announcement this week on the back of a couple of acquisitions it made this year of Affirmed Networks and Metaswitch. Have I got that right?
Yep.
Not totally senile yet. That's good to know. And basically they said that they've come up with Azure for operators.
Yeah.
And Azure is their cloud platform. And there's basically three main public cloud players, which is AWS, Amazon, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud.
Yeah.
And they're all quite keen on working with operators these days, aren't they?
Yeah.
So we had a little chat about that, and this is something Danielle's been talking about for a while, and her big thing is pro-public cloud, anti-private cloud. I don't really understand the minutiae of it well enough to comment on her position, but if I had to dumb it down to Scott language, it would just be that, in terms of sort of things like interoperability and this off-the-peg kind of stuff, and also the low capex, the public cloud just makes sense because it's all just sitting there for you, and people like AWS and Microsoft and Google have done a great job of creating sort of special tools for particular verticals such as telcos.
Yeah, but it's a big move for telcos to do that, and it's not happened. So
why do you think?
Well, I talked to Gabriel Brown at Heavy Reading and James Crawshaw at Omdia about the Microsoft announcement,
right,
to get their sort of perspective on it and just sort of get an idea of the trends, I guess, really, and what's going on. But and Gabe was like, this is a really big statement by Microsoft of its intentions here. It really sees an opportunity to go and be the, and he said it's got a much more sort of coherent offer and pitch than the other two players at the moment.
Okay.
They had this very interesting table actually in their blog they put together where they had all the different sort of
That's
parts.
I nearly used that one.
And everything was sort of lit up, but we can cover this apart from radio access network. And then I remember specifically asking a few people this week, actually, both those guys, but also some people in the industry, could you see, as you say, they bought Affirmed Networks and Metaswitch, which are core network providers.
Right.
Well, Altiostar with Rakuten, this is basically what Rakuten's doing with Altiostar, is taking that radio software and doing a similar thing. You host it through a cloud platform. What about, Microsoft perhaps going out and buying someone like Mavenir or Parallel Wireless?
I was going to say, yeah.
Which
Why not?
Well, I got mixed views on that. I mean, but I think Gabe was less convinced that something like that might happen because he said, in theory, you could do something like that and run the software that way, but it's more complicated because there's obviously, and as we know, there's a much more sort of hardware side to the whole sort of radio access network. There's antennas. It's not just a software game. You need to go out and build sites. And
do they really want to overreach?
And there's
far?
There's going to be some kind of overlap. There's going to have to be some kind of knowledge about how that works. So it's a harder one to see
biggest
happening,
overlap comes at the edge, doesn't it? The impression I get from the big sort of internet giants is they want part of the action, but their interest kind of stops at the edge.
Yeah,
and that's fine. So they've got to get good at the edge, and as long as the data centers they run at the edge can interact with Open RAN type of stuff.
Yeah.
At the sort of radio level, then I guess there's no need for them to get directly involved.
But certainly in the core network side, as you say, Affirmed and Metaswitch gives Microsoft the ability to do that already. The thing is, they haven't got telcos. I don't think either James or Gabriel could come up with an example of a company that's gone into a deal where it's put its core network on the public cloud.
Yeah.
What you tend to see happening is...
Well, culturally, that's a really tough one for us.
It's a tough one. I mean, you're basically entrusting a big, a sensitive area of your network. The whole Huawei debate that we were just talking about earlier is about how sensitive the core is. You're basically saying this stuff's been on your own data centers, your own private clouds, basically your own data centers. All of a sudden, you're giving a sort of ownership of it almost to Microsoft,
It's a metaphor for me is my attitude to music and why I've yet to subscribe to Spotify.
Yeah.
I like to buy the CDs and have them. And I'll burn them onto my computer and I'll listen to it as digital music on my phone or whatever. Or, put them into the cloud with Google Music. But I still like to have the master.
Yeah.
And I just don't like the thought of if I stop paying Spotify its money, then no more music for Scott.
So I think it's a cultural thing, but it's also, if it does start to go this way, and some of the people I was talking to are more convinced that it will, and even James and Gabe were both saying in the future it's going to start to happen. We'll see some company do this, and then it could open the floodgates to some extent. You see others following, especially if it works out really well and they get the sort of margin savings that everybody's talking about. Where does it go? In the future, you're talking about 3 big cloud players that have already taken control of retail and all sorts of other sectors and disrupted them. And this is one area that still sort of belongs to the telcos in a way. And
totally.
then obviously you're entrusting this thing with, what if all telcos in the world decide at some point in the future that they should shift their software into the public cloud? It's quite a scary thought because it gives a small number of companies control over something that's that essential to the way we sort of live our lives nowadays. And
just to illustrate that point, there was another story I wrote, which I'm not going to go into great depth, especially as I keep getting looks from Pierre. Is a battery about to run out or something? No. Just time. Okay. So I'll sort of wrap it up here then, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
But I wrote, there's a little story about how Amazon's come up with a palm reader for retail. So you can just pay, it's like a fingerprint reader, but it's just palm. And the thing is, you don't even need to touch.
Yep.
You can read it from a couple of inches away. And a lot of the American press were like, this is a bit weird, this is a bit dystopian. And I sort of thought, okay, but why? And there's nothing intrinsically wrong with it from a privacy point of view. It's exactly the same as using a fingerprint reader, which is what I use to unlock this. And I don't think twice about that. But just the thought that there's just yet another bit of your life which you're entrusting to Amazon, because they're going to license this stuff out in a bit like the Rakuten model.
Yeah.
And so if suddenly Amazon's controlling how you physically interact with the commercial world at all places, because this will be used for getting into stadiums, used for paying for stuff, then yes, it does come to a point where you're like, is there anything that isn't controlled by one of the fangs?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Well, I'll leave it there. But that's certainly the direction of travel, isn't it?
It's a worrying thought.
And I think back to the telco cloud, I think it's understandable for the telco community to have some resistance on that basis, even if practically, as people like Danielle would probably insist, there are tons of advantages to them.
Yeah.
It might be irrational.
Very much looking at it from a business perspective.
Yeah.
And it's efficiency is the driver to do it. But culturally, you can see, and not just from a telco perspective. I mean, if you're a regulator or a consumer, it's a question for us that those players, it comes up all the time, the power those companies have.
Yeah, and everything's groovy now, but then in a year's time, they change their T's and C's.
Yeah.
And they hold you to ransom. Yeah, I'd feel a bit queasy about it as well. Okay, cool. Don't want any more dirty looks from Pierre, so I'm going to wrap it up there. So thanks a lot for watching, and make sure you join us for the next one.